Imagine America at the end of the 1930s. The country was just starting to recover from the Great Depression. People remembered the lines for free soup, the ruined farms, and the closed factories. And at this moment, a new world slaughter began somewhere across the ocean. Europe was burning again. But Americans looked at all of this and thought, no, not again. You see, deep inside the average American of that time lived a profound weariness of foreign wars. The First World War was still fresh in memory. Young guys went off to the trenches of France, returning crippled or not returning at all. And for what? So that European kings and presidents could continue their games? Many Americans sincerely believed that they had been dragged into a foreign war, and then the Europeans hadn't even repaid their war debts. Bitterness and disappointment ran deep. In this atmosphere, a movement appeared that called itself America First. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? But then, in the late 1930s, it was a real political force. Imagine huge rallies where thousands of people chanted that America did not need European problems. Among the movement's activists were not marginals, but respected people, famous industrialists, aviators, even senators. They spoke a simple truth. Let Hitler and Stalin sort things out among themselves, and we will take care of our own. And you know what the most interesting thing is? Most Americans agreed with them. Polls showed that 7 out of 10 citizens were vehemently opposed to entering the war. People told their congressmen, if you vote for war, we will vote against you in the next elections. This was not just an opinion, it was a political reality. Now let's imagine that things happened differently. In our history, Franklin Roosevelt won the election in 1940th year, and although he was cautious publicly, he inwardly understood that America would have to intervene. He began preparing the country for war, even though he did it quietly so as not to anger the voters. But imagine that a different candidate won. Let's call him, hypothetically, an isolationist. A person who sincerely believed that the oceans would protect America better than any army. This new president comes to power with a clear mandate: stay away from the European slaughter. He appoints people who share his views to key posts. The Secretary of Defense says that American boys have no reason to die for Poland or France. The Secretary of State explains that America has no vital interests in Europe. Congress willingly adopts laws prohibiting the sale of weapons to belligerent countries. And that's when the most interesting part begins. In the autumn of 1941st year, Britain desperately begs for help. German submarines are sinking convoys with food. London is burning from bombings. The Prime Minister sends telegrams one after another. Give us ships, planes, anything. But the American president throws up his hands. Congress won't give money, the people protest. The isolationist press screams, "This is not our war." In our history, the Lend-Lease program appeared, a brilliant scheme where America loaned weapons to the Allies. If your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't sell him a fire hose, you lend it to him. That's how Roosevelt explained it. But in the alternative reality, this doesn't happen. Or it happens on such a microscopic scale that it doesn't make a difference. A few outdated destroyers, a couple of hundred planes, a drop in the ocean compared to what actually happened. The British are left alone with the German war machine. The Soviet Union is also fighting alone. No American trucks, canned goods, or locomotives. Thousands of tanks, millions of shells that arrived via Lend-Lease in real history simply do not exist in this world. And then the moment of truth arrives. 7th of December, 1941st year. Sunday morning, Hawaii, Pearl Harbor Naval Base. In our history, this is where everything changed. The Japanese attack instantly transformed isolationist America into a furious warrior. The next day, the country declared war with a unanimity that had not been seen before. But what if that Sunday passed quietly? Maybe the Japanese decided not to attack, fearing to wake the sleeping giant. Or perhaps the attack did happen, but the isolationist president behaved differently. Imagine, instead of a call to arms, he says something like, "Yes, this is a tragedy, but the Pacific possessions are far from our shores. Let's strengthen the defense of California and Florida, and the Philippines, well, they are too far away to defend. Does that sound crazy? But in that atmosphere of fear of war, such a scenario is entirely possible. Congress could decide that a local conflict with Japan was not worth a full-scale war. Isolationist newspapers would write, "The tragedy in Hawaii must not drag us into an Asian war." And so, step by step, America stays out. The army is not mobilized. Factories do not switch to war production. Young men do not go to the front. The country lives its own life while a nightmare unfolds across the oceans. European cities turn into ruins. Millions perish. Empires collapse. And America watches all this from afar, across the oceanic distance. So, America stayed out. Now let's imagine what is happening across the ocean, in burning Europe. The picture unfolding there is far from rosy. Let's start with Britain. Autumn of 41st year, London is regularly bombed. Cities are in ruins. People hide in the subway. But the main trouble comes not from the sky, but from the depths of the ocean. German submarines, these gray wolves of the Atlantic, methodically sink British convoys. Every day, cargo ships carrying food, coal, metal, everything without which an island nation simply cannot exist, go to the bottom. You see, Britain is an island. It cannot feed itself. It needs a constant flow of imports, otherwise famine will begin in a couple of months. And the Germans understand this perfectly. Their Admiral Dönitz developed a simple but cruel strategy: sink British ships faster than the British can build them. If successful, Britain will suffocate without a single soldier landing on its soil. In our real history, Americans seriously joined the Battle of the Atlantic. Their destroyers escorted convoys, their aviation patrolled the ocean, their shipyards built ships by the tens. But in the alternative history, this is absent. The British fleet fights alone, and the forces are unequal. Imagine the captain of a British destroyer. He must protect a convoy of 40 cargo ships. Somewhere there, in the dark water, German submarines are lurking, maybe 3, maybe 10, it's unknown. They attack at night, fire torpedoes, and dive. An explosion, another explosion, flames on the water, sailors drowning, and the destroyer rushes between the burning ships, trying to find the invisible enemy. By morning, 30 of the 40 ships remain. A week later, 20. Half reach the shores of Britain. Without American aid, losses grow catastrophically. In our history, the peak of the crisis came at the beginning of 42nd year, but then the Allies turned the tide. In the alternative reality, the turning point does not happen. German submarines continue their deadly work month after month. And now let's look at Britain from the inside. Food rations are cut again and again. First meat is reduced, then sugar, then bread. Food lines get longer and longer. People start to genuinely starve. Factories stop. There is no metal to produce shells. The Royal Air Force reduces sorties. Aviation fuel runs out. Churchill delivers his famous speeches about fighting to the end, but even his iron will cannot change the mathematics. An island nation simply cannot physically fight without external supplies. And external supplies sink in the Atlantic faster than they arrive. Somewhere around the middle of 42nd year, talks begin in the British government about the unthinkable, negotiations with Germany. At first it is a whisper behind closed doors, but gradually the voices grow louder. Influential people emerge who say, "We cannot win, we can only continue to bleed. Maybe it's time to negotiate while we still have some cards in hand." Churchill resists fiercely, but he is not omnipotent. The king is nervous, Parliament is split, the people are tired. Imagine a British mother whose 3 children are underfed and whose husband died in North Africa. When she is told about the heroic struggle, she thinks about a piece of bread for her children. By the autumn of 42nd, Britain perhaps enters into an armistice. Not complete surrender, no, negotiations. Germany by this time is bogged down in Russia and is also not averse to consolidating its successes in the West. Some kind of compromise peace is concluded. Britain maintains independence but recognizes German dominance in Europe. German troops do not land in England, but Hitler gets what he wanted: free hands in the East. And what about the East? A grandiose tragedy unfolds there. The Soviet Union meets the German invasion in the summer of 41st. The first months are a catastrophe. The Germans advance on all fronts, encircle armies, and take cities. By winter, the enemy stands near Moscow and Leningrad. But here, the history of our world and the alternative reality begin to diverge ever more strongly. In reality, the USSR receives help from the Allies. At first, little, a couple of hundred tanks and planes by the end of 41st, then more and more. By 43rd year, American trucks, canned goods, metal, locomotives, shoes, and gunpowder flow in a torrent. Many say that Lend-Lease was not decisive. Yes, Soviet industry produced the lion's share of weapons itself, but the devil is in the details. Soviet factories made tanks and guns, while the Americans supplied what the USSR lacked the capacity for. Trucks, for example. Imagine, a tank without a truck to bring fuel and shells is just a pile of iron. American canned goods and stew fed the soldiers. American aluminum went into the production of airplanes. American locomotives pulled trains carrying troops and ammunition. In the alternative history, none of this exists. Soviet factories produce weapons, but logistics suffer. There aren't enough trucks. Ammunition is delivered slowly. Hungry soldiers fight worse. The railway network is overloaded and worn out. Troops are late for the front. The winter of 41st to 42nd passes roughly the same way as in reality. The Germans are repelled from Moscow, but not by much. In the summer of 42nd, the German offensive begins in the south. In real history, it led to Stalingrad, the greatest battle that turned the tide of the war. And what about the alternative reality? The Battle of Stalingrad still happens. The city is too important. But the USSR's forces are more strained. The Germans, not distracted by Africa and not fearing a second front, throw in more troops. The battle drags on. Maybe the Germans take part of the city. Maybe the encirclement is incomplete. Or maybe the Red Army simply bleeds more severely than usual. By the spring of 43rd year, both sides are on the verge of exhaustion. The Germans are preparing an operation at the Kursk salient, a last attempt to defeat the Red Army. In our history, this offensive stalled. The Soviet defense was iron, and then the counteroffensive began. But in the alternative world, the Soviet defense is weaker. Fewer trucks, it's harder to transfer reserves. Fewer planes made of Lend-Lease aluminum, weaker air cover. The Germans break through the defense deeper. The Battle of Kursk turns not into a triumph of Soviet arms, but into a bloody meat grinder where it's unclear who won. By the autumn of 43rd, both sides look at each other across fields strewn with corpses and think one thing: we cannot continue like this. Germany is exhausted. Its armies have been bleeding for the second year. Industry is at its limit. Allies are unreliable. The USSR is also on the brink. The losses are monstrous. The country is in ruins. The people are worn out to the extreme. And then secret negotiations begin. First through intermediaries, maybe through neutral Sweden or Turkey. They test the waters. Are you ready to stop? Both sides are cautious, but the very idea of an armistice no longer seems insane. Stalin never wanted to fight to Berlin just for the sake of Berlin. He wanted the security of the USSR and a sphere of influence. By 43rd year, Hitler realized that there would be no lightning victory. Maybe they can agree? Imagine, somewhere in the late 43rd or early 44th year, an armistice is announced. Germany retains most of its conquests in Eastern Europe: Poland, the Baltics, part of Belarus, Ukraine up to the Dnieper. The USSR holds everything east of that. A demilitarized zone is created. Exchange of prisoners. Silence. This silence is not peace. It is just a respite, a frozen conflict. Both sides lick their wounds. build up strength, and distrust each other for a second. A grim balance of fear reigns in Europe. The German Reich stretches from the Atlantic to the Dnieper, the Soviet Union from the Dnieper to the Pacific Ocean, exhausted Britain on its island, and distant America, which decided not to intervene and is now watching this nightmare from afar. This is what Europe might have been like without American intervention. Not the victory of good over evil, but a dirty compromise of empires worn out to the extreme. History would have taken a completely different path. But that's not all. We have only talked about the European theater of war so far. And on the other side of the world, in the Pacific Ocean, events unfolded no less dramatically. So we talked about Europe, where the Germans and Soviets eventually bled out and froze in a shaky respite. But let's now move to the other side of the world, to Asia and the Pacific Ocean. Its own drama unfolded there, no less terrifying, and perhaps even more cruel. Japan in the late 1930s was an empire with great ambitions and small resources. You see, the Japanese islands are poor in everything needed for war: oil, rubber, metals. All of this has to be imported. And Japan is growing rapidly, the population is increasing, industry is developing, and the islands are simply not enough. The Japanese look around and see vast Asia, rich, weak, divided into European colonies, and so they create a beautiful idea, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Sounds almost romantic, doesn't it? Japanese propaganda told the Asian peoples, "Brothers, we are all Asians. We have been oppressed for centuries by white colonizers from Europe. Let's unite under the leadership of Japan and create a new world, free from Western domination." In reality, of course, this was a cover for the most common colonial expansion. Only instead of European masters, Japanese ones came. And you know what? The Japanese turned out to be far more cruel masters than the Europeans ever were. In our real history, Japanese expansion was stopped by the American fleet. The Battle of Midway, islands conquered back one by one, a naval blockade suffocating Japan. But in the alternative world, where America stayed home, everything goes completely differently. Winter of 41st to 42nd year. Japanese armies crashed down upon the entire Pacific region simultaneously. The Philippines fall quickly. The American garrison there was symbolic, and without reinforcements from the metropole, they are doomed. The Dutch East Indies, meaning Indonesia, a huge archipelago with oil fields, also falls to the Japanese virtually without a fight. The Dutch themselves were bogged down in the war in Europe. Their fleet is weak, and the colonial troops are a handful of white officers with poorly trained local soldiers. Malaya, with its tin mines and rubber plantations, is captured. Singapore, the impregnable British fortress protecting sea lanes, falls. In real history, this was a blow to Britain's prestige, but there was at least hope for return. In the alternative world, the British realize there will be no return. They have no strength, no fleet, and the Americans will not come to the rescue. And now imagine the next step: Australia and New Zealand. In reality, these countries were saved precisely by American aid. The American fleet covered the sea lanes, American troops defended the islands between Japan and Australia. But without America, what will protect the fifth continent? Australia in the early 42nds is a huge, almost empty country. The population is only about 7 million people. Most live on the eastern coast. The army is small, the fleet is weak, and there is almost no aviation. And from the north, the Japanese war machine, which has already captured half of Asia, is advancing. In the spring of 42nd, Japanese landings take place in northern Australia. Darwin is bombed as brutally as Pearl Harbor once was. Japanese troops move deep into the continent. Australians retreat, losing city after city. By autumn, the Japanese control the entire north and begin to threaten the major cities of the eastern coast. It is difficult for the Japanese to completely capture Australia. It is too big, and the distances are enormous. But they don't need to. They occupy key ports, establish control over the seas, and Australia is essentially cut off from the world. The remaining government either capitulates or continues to exist somewhere deep inside the continent, controlling desert territories where the Japanese are too lazy to go. New Zealand, even more distant and weak, becomes a Japanese protectorate. The local population is stunned. They are white British, an ordinary Western country. How did they suddenly find themselves under the rule of an Asian empire? And so, by the middle of 43rd year, all of East and Southeast Asia, plus a significant part of Oceania, are in the hands of Japan. A vast empire emerges, stretching from the borders of India to Australia, from China to the Pacific archipelagos. Officially, it is called the co-prosperity sphere, but the reality is completely different. Let's talk about how people live in this sphere of prosperity. Let's start with China, because the Japanese dominated there the longest, since 37th year. The Chinese War was not just a military campaign for the Japanese, but something more. They considered the Chinese an inferior race, subhumans who needed to be conquered and reformed. Remember the Nanking Massacre? At the end of 37th year, Japanese troops captured the Chinese capital and staged a 6-week nightmare there. Mass murder, rape, torture. According to various estimates, between 200,000 and 300,000 people died. Women were raped in front of their families. Children were killed by throwing them against walls. Old people were burned alive. And you know what the scariest thing is? This was not an accident, not rebellious soldiers. It was policy. The Japanese command deliberately permitted and sometimes encouraged atrocities in order to break the Chinese will to resist. In the alternative reality where no one stops Japan, this policy continues and intensifies. Entire provinces of China turn into gigantic labor camps. Millions of Chinese are herded into mines, construction sites for defensive structures, and factories. They work until death, literally. Died of exhaustion? No problem. A new batch of workers is coming. Special medical units are created to conduct experiments on living people. They test the effects of biological and chemical weapons and test the limits of human endurance in monstrous conditions. These are not isolated criminals. This is a state program. The situation is similar in Indonesia, the Philippines, and Malaya. The Japanese declare that they have come to liberate Asians from white colonizers. Some local nationalists even rejoice at first. But joy quickly turns to horror. It turns out that the Japanese masters are far worse than the Europeans. The Dutch in Indonesia squeezed profit from the colony, yes, but they at least maintained infrastructure, schools and hospitals. The Japanese don't need that. They need resources: oil, rubber, tin, rice. All of this is pumped out to the metropole without regard for the local population. Mass starvation begins. Rice, which had fed Indonesians and Filipinos for centuries, is now requisitioned for the Japanese army. People starve, and if anyone dares to protest, public executions. Troublemakers are hanged or beheaded in public squares, and the population is forced to watch. Women and girls are forcibly taken to comfort stations, a euphemism for military brothels. Tens, and perhaps hundreds of thousands of Korean, Chinese, Filipino, and Indonesian women become sex slaves for Japanese soldiers. Many do not survive this nightmare. Men are mobilized for forced labor. They build roads, airfields, and fortifications. The famous Death Railway between Thailand and Burma, built on the bones of prisoners of war and local workers, is a reality. In the alternative world, there are more such projects, and the mortality rate is even higher. And what about India, you ask? British India, the jewel in the crown, is now in mortal danger. Japan controls all of Burma. Its troops stand on the borders of India. If Britain concluded an armistice with Germany and Europe, it has no forces to defend distant colonies. The Japanese invasion of India begins in 43rd year. They use Indian nationalists who hate the British and are ready to cooperate with anyone for independence. A puppet provisional government of Free India is created, which declares war on Britain. The Indian Army, consisting mostly of local soldiers under the command of British officers, begins to fall apart. Many Indians do not want to die for their colonizers. Desertion, riots, defecting to the Japanese side. By 44th year, Japan controls eastern India. They cannot completely conquer the subcontinent with its huge population, but they don't need to. It is enough to control the coast, key cities, and resources. And so, a vast Japanese empire emerges, stretching over half of Asia. On the map, it looks impressive. But inside this empire, a nightmare unfolds. Millions of people are enslaved, killed, and maimed. Entire peoples live in fear of the Japanese occupiers. The economy of these territories works unilaterally. Everything valuable flows to Japan, and nothing returns. Singapore, once a rich trading port, turns into a military base. The Philippines, where education once developed, slide back into the Middle Ages. Cultural genocide is in full swing. The Japanese ban local languages in schools, forcing people to learn Japanese. They rename cities, demolish temples, and destroy cultural monuments. They want not just to conquer these peoples. They want to erase their identity, turn them into obedient Japanized subjects. And all this happens before the eyes of distant America, which chose isolation. Newspapers sometimes write about the atrocities in Asia, but most Americans shrug. Those are their problems, not ours, they think. No one understands that the world being born on the other side of the Pacific Ocean will one day come to their shores. We have reached the turning point. It is the year 1945, in our reality, the year of victory, the triumph of the Allies, the liberation of Europe. But in the alternative history, everything is completely different. Let's stop and look at the world map. What do we see? 3 huge empires that have divided the planet among themselves. In the west, the German Reich, stretching from the Atlantic to somewhere near the Dnieper or even further. In the east, the Soviet Union, exhausted, bled out, but still standing. And on the other side of the world, the Japanese Empire, sprawled across all of Asia and half of the Pacific Ocean. Lost between these giants are the remnants of the old world. Britain on its island, formally independent but realistically turned into a secondary power. America across the ocean, rich but isolated, and now looking at a world that has become strange and terrifying. Now let's figure out exactly how the war ended in Europe. 2 main scenarios are possible here, and both are grim. The first option is a compromise peace. By the middle of 44th year, both Germany and the USSR realized that neither could win definitively. Every offensive stalls in blood, every victory comes at such a cost that it becomes indistinguishable from defeat. And so, negotiations begin through intermediaries. Imagine this scene. Somewhere in a neutral country, maybe in Sweden or Switzerland, representatives of the 2 exhausted empires meet in conditions of strictest secrecy. The Soviet delegation understands. Another year of such war, and the country will simply fall apart. The German delegation thinks the same thing. They hate each other, but weariness is stronger than hatred. The bargaining is fierce. Where will the border run? Germany wants to keep all of Ukraine up to the Dnieper. There is black soil, grain, coal. The USSR insists that the Dnieper is too far. Let's use the Dniester. Months of negotiations, while the slaughter continues on the fronts. Finally, by the spring of 45th year, a compromise is found. Germany gets Poland, the Baltics, Belarus, Western Ukraine. The USSR keeps Eastern Ukraine, Russia, the Caucasus, Central Asia. A demilitarized buffer zone is created. Prisoners of war are exchanged, those who are still alive. An armistice is announced. Both sides call this an honorable peace, a strategic victory. In reality, it is simply an admission that further fighting is impossible. Hitler is aging, ailing, but formally won. His Reich controls almost all of Europe. Stalin also formally did not lose. The USSR stood firm, the enemy did not advance further. But at what cost? The second option is a Soviet victory. More dramatic, more bloody. In this scenario, the USSR, despite all the difficulties, still breaks the back of the Wehrmacht. Maybe by 45th year the German economy collapsed. Maybe a revolt happened in Germany itself. Or maybe simply the Soviet soldiers proved to be slightly more resilient, slightly more stubborn. The Red Army, step by step, losing hundreds of thousands of people for every kilometer, moves west. It liberates Poland, enters Germany. By the summer of 45th, it takes Berlin. But this victory is not like the triumph of our history. There is no Allied parade, no fraternization of American and Soviet soldiers on the Elbe. Only exhausted Soviet troops in the ruins of Europe, and no one who could help rebuild the destroyed. In this option, the USSR liberates all of Eastern Europe, maybe even reaching France. All of continental Europe ends up in the Soviet sphere of influence. Imagine Paris, Rome, Madrid look east and see Soviet tanks. Is it scary? Absolutely. But whichever option is realized, there is one tragedy that unites both scenarios: the Holocaust. In our real history, American troops liberated concentration camps in Western Germany in the spring of 45th. Dachau, Buchenwald, Flossenburg. Soviet troops liberated camps in the east: Auschwitz, Majdanek, Treblinka. By May, the entire nightmare was stopped. But what about the alternative world? If the war dragged on, if the armistice happened earlier, many camps remained in the German zone of control. Imagine, somewhere in Bavaria, in a quiet forest, stands a death camp. In our history, the Americans liberated it in April. In the alternative, it continues to operate. SS men methodically continue their work. Trains keep arriving, gas chambers operate, crematoria smoke. Maybe by the autumn of 45th, when an armistice has already been announced, someone in Berlin finally gives the order to stop the killings. Not out of humanity, but simply because the war is over, there is no need to waste resources. By this time, the number of Holocaust victims exceeds 6 million, the figure from our history. Maybe 7, maybe 8 million. No one will know for sure, because the Germans destroyed most of the documents. Surviving, exhausted prisoners tell terrifying stories, but who will hear them? The world is busy with something else, counting losses, rebuilding the destroyed, establishing new borders. And here we come to a very important point. In our reality, the Nuremberg Tribunal took place after the war. This was a unique moment in human history. For the first time, the leaders of a defeated state faced an international court for war crimes. American, Soviet, British, and French judges sat at the same table. The accused, the highest leadership of the Third Reich, listened to the testimony of witnesses and watched documentary evidence. The whole world followed the process. Sentences for war criminals were handed down publicly. Executions of war criminals were broadcast. Nuremberg became a moral victory for humanity. It established the principle: following criminal orders does not absolve responsibility. Aggressive war is a crime. Genocide is a crime. No position, no uniform will protect against punishment. But in the alternative world, nothing of the sort happens. If an armistice is concluded, the Nazi leadership remains in power. Hitler may die of illness, but his successors continue to rule the Reich. Goering, Himmler, Goebbels, they all die in their beds, old and revered. Even if the USSR won completely, the Soviet tribunal would not be like Nuremberg. There would be no Western judges, no international resonance. The Soviets would conduct their own trial, execute a couple of dozens of the main Nazis, and the rest would either escape or disappear into the chaos of post-war Europe. Thousands of SS men, Gestapo agents, and camp guards avoid punishment. They change names, burn documents, and hide. Without the American system for searching for war criminals, without worldwide public attention, most murderers will remain unpunished. And so, by the end of 45th year, we get a world divided among three empires. Germany, though weakened but undefeated, rules Western and Central Europe. The Soviet Union, bled out, holds Eastern Europe and Asia. Japan reigns supreme from India to Australia. There is no friendship between them, only cold distrust and exhaustion. Each empire licks its wounds, restores industry, and prepares for the next round. Because everyone understands, this is not peace, it is a respite. In Europe, millions of refugees wander along ruined roads. Cities lie in ruins. Fields have not been plowed for years. Famine, disease, chaos. Surviving Jews, Roma, and Slavs try to find their relatives and discover that no one is left. Triumphant Nazi officials manage the occupied territories, imposing a new order. In Asia, Japanese garrisons keep hundreds of millions of conquered peoples in check. Chinese, Koreans, Filipinos live in fear and humiliation. The continent's wealth flows to Tokyo, and the locals get scraps. The Soviet Union slowly recovers after monstrous losses. 30, maybe 40 million dead. That is more than in our history. Entire regions are depopulated. Industry is destroyed. But Stalin holds power with an iron fist and prepares for a new confrontation. And distant America looks at all this and thinks, did we do the right thing by staying out? But it's too late. The world has changed, and it cannot be brought back. Instead of the American century, the era of the three empires has begun, an era of fear, distrust, and the anticipation of a new war. While the world is burning in the fire of war, let's return home to America. The very America that chose isolation and is now reaping the fruits of that decision. Spoiler, the fruits turned out to be bitter. In our real history, the Second World War saved the American economy. It sounds cynical, but it is a fact. The Great Depression began in 1929, and by 41st year, the country still hadn't fully recovered. Unemployment hovered around 15%, factories worked at half capacity, people were barely making ends meet. And then the war began. Suddenly, everything changed. Factories received military orders. Tanks, planes, ships were needed immediately and in huge quantities. Unemployment disappeared within a year. Everyone who could hold a wrench or operate a machine found work. Wages rose. Women went into production, replacing the men who had gone to the front. The economy boomed. Gross domestic product skyrocketed. By 45th year, America had become the richest country in the world. But in the alternative reality, none of this happens. There are no military orders. Factories continue to stand idle. Unemployment remains high. And this is where the most interesting part begins, the social and political crisis. Imagine an ordinary American, say from Detroit, autumn of 42nd year. He has been unemployed for the third year in a row. He scrapes by with odd jobs. His wife is tired, the children are hungry, there is no money for rent. He turns on the radio and hears that there is a war in Europe, that Germans and Russians are slaughtering each other by the millions. And his president says, "This is not our war, we will stay out." On the one hand, he understands. He has no reason to die in foreign trenches. But on the other hand, where is the job? In a nearby town, guys say that if military production had started, the factories would have come alive. But no, the government clings to its isolationism. And it is in this atmosphere of despair and disappointment that radical movements begin to strengthen. On the left, the communists. They tell the workers simple things. Look at the Soviet Union. There is no unemployment there. The factories are working. The state cares about ordinary people. Capitalism has rotted. A revolution is needed. In our history, American communists were marginalized because the war united the nation against a common enemy, and post-war prosperity gave people hope. But in the alternative reality, where the Depression drags on indefinitely, the communists have real chances. Trade unions become radicalized. Strikes become tougher. Clashes with the police begin somewhere in the factories. Governors call out the National Guard. Blood in the streets. Society splits. And on the right, pro-fascist movements grow. Remember America First. In our history, that committee disbanded after Pearl Harbor, but in the alternative reality, it only gets stronger. By the middle of the 42nds, it no longer has 800,000 members, but maybe 1.5 or 2 million. Their leaders look at Germany and see order, strength, the unity of the nation. They say, Hitler lifted his country out of ruin in a few years. Why can't we do the same? Maybe democracy doesn't work. Maybe we need a strong leader who will restore order. Anti-Semitism, which was quite widespread in America in the 1930s, now comes out of the shadows. It was the Jewish bankers who ruined the country, street agitators shout. Jews want to drag us into war for their interests. Pogroms begin in some cities. Jewish shops are smashed, synagogues are set on fire. The government tries to balance between these extremes, but it gets harder every year. The election of 44th year takes place in an atmosphere of unprecedented hostility. Maybe a populist comes to power, promising to solve all problems with an iron fist. Or, on the contrary, a left-wing radical with a socialist program. In any case, American democracy is cracking at the seams. Now let's talk about culture. In our history, the 1940s gave birth to the greatest generation. Those who went through the war, defeated fascism, returned home, and built a prosperous America. This generation became the foundation of national identity, the pride of the country. But in the alternative reality, such a generation does not exist. The young people of the 1940s did not go through the crucible of war, did not know the brotherhood of the trenches, did not experience the triumph of victory. Instead, they grew up in an atmosphere of depression, unemployment, political infighting, and social division. Hollywood, which in our history filmed patriotic war movies, now specializes in something else. Maybe dark dramas about unemployment and poverty, or escapist musicals that help people forget reality. The American dream, the idea that anyone can succeed through hard work, looks increasingly false. And what about foreign policy? America isolated itself from Europe and Asia, but it cannot simply close itself off from the whole world. And so, eyes turned south to Latin America. In our history, the U.S. dominated the Western Hemisphere, but did so relatively gently because it was preoccupied with world affairs. In the alternative reality, where America is cut off from big politics, the Latin American direction becomes the only way to realize the ambitions of a great power. Active expansion begins. American companies aggressively seize Latin American markets. Governments that Washington dislikes are overthrown with the help of local militaries. The Marines land in one banana republic after another to restore order. Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean gradually turn into America's backyard in the most literal sense. Local regimes are puppets, economies work for export to the U.S., resources are pumped out. This breeds enormous hatred for the gringos throughout Latin America. Brazil and Argentina, larger countries, try to resist. Nationalist movements begin there, sometimes with a fascist tinge. After all, fascism was not defeated in Europe. It looks like a perfectly viable ideology. Latin America becomes an arena of cold and sometimes hot war between pro-American and anti-American forces. Now about technology. In our history, the war gave a powerful impetus to scientific progress. Radar, jet aviation, nuclear energy, computers, all of this appeared or accelerated due to military research. The famous Manhattan Project created the atomic bomb. The British invented the first computers to break German codes. The Americans developed a computer for calculating artillery tables. In the alternative reality, this stimulus is absent. Without war, there is no urgent need for new technologies. Research continues, but slower, without the frantic pace of wartime. Nuclear weapons may not appear at all, or appear decades later. Computers remain an exotic laboratory curiosity. All that post-war technological revolution that made America a leader simply does not happen. American universities are still strong, but they lack the huge military grants that funded research in our history. German and Japanese scientists do not flee to the US, as they did in reality. By the end of the 40-50s, America is a country in deep crisis. Economically lagging, politically divided, socially strained. It is still rich in natural resources, it has a large population, and developed industry. But the dynamic is wrong. Instead of growth, stagnation. Instead of unity, division. Instead of optimism, disappointment. And when Americans look at the world map, they see three huge empires that have divided the planet. The German Reich in Europe, Japan in Asia, the USSR between them. A terrifying, strange world that America does not fit into. And many begin to ask, did we make the right choice? Maybe we should have intervened. But it's too late. History does not tolerate the subjunctive mood. The choice has been made, and now they must live with the consequences. The war is over, but the world has not become calmer. Honestly, it has become even more dangerous. Because now it is divided among three nuclear powers, and each looks at the others with distrust, bordering on outright hostility. Let's examine this new alignment of forces. In our real history, the Cold War was primarily a confrontation between America and the Soviet Union. Two poles, two ideologies, two visions of the future. But in the alternative world, the picture is more complex. If we take the option of an armistice between Germany and the USSR, the end of the war looks like this. Both exhausted empires sign a treaty, recognizing each other as equals, but equal enemies. Along the border, roughly along the Dniester or Dnieper, a huge line of military fortifications is built. On one side, German troops, ready for resistance. On the other, Soviet. Barbed wire stretches between them, empty and cold, just as cold as their mutual relationship. Germany controls Western and Central Europe. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, everything between the Atlantic and its new border in the east, obey it. The administrative apparatus of the Nazi machine continues to work, although combat operations have ceased. The Gestapo is still active. Concentration camps quietly function, although not on such scales. Nazi ideology remains the state ideology. But Germany is concerned. It knows that the Soviet Union, with its vast expanses and human reserve, is a formidable enemy. Hitler, if he is still alive, or his successors begin to urgently develop nuclear weapons. German science is good. They have physicists and industry. By the end of 46th year, maybe by 47th, Germany possesses its own atomic bomb. The Soviet Union, for its part, knows this. Stalin orders the creation of nuclear weapons faster. Soviet physicists are driven hard, promised either execution or enormous privileges, depending on the situation. And so, by the end of 46th, maybe by the beginning of 47th, the USSR also tests its atomic bomb. Now we have two nuclear states, separated by a line of fortifications, with millions of soldiers on the border. Each waits for the moment when it can strike. But nuclear weapons make such a strike impossible. They guarantee mutual destruction. The Cold War begins, but in a completely different format than in our history. There is no ideological confrontation between capitalism and communism, because on the right stands not liberal America, but Nazi Germany. Instead, these are wars of totalitarian ideologies. Nazism versus communism. Two variants of tyranny, trying to prove to each other which one is more perfect. Propaganda on both sides is rampant. Nazi radio screams that the Soviets are Asian barbarians who will destroy civilization. Soviet radio replies that the Nazis are imperialist fascists, enemies of the working class. In occupied Europe, the Nazis conduct ideological indoctrination. In Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe and Asia, the same thing, but with a red star instead of a swastika. Small armed conflicts constantly occur on the borders. Border skirmishes, sabotage groups, espionage. Life is on the brink of war, but the war itself does not start. It would be too expensive. And what is between them? What happened to Britain? Remember, we talked about its armistice with Germany. It remains formally independent, but realistically under German pressure. The British crown remains, but London is in the German sphere of influence. This allows Hitler to say that he respects European traditions, not destroying it wholesale, like the Russians. But life in occupied Europe is not life. The economy works on the principle of plunder. Resources flow to Berlin. The local population is fed on a residual basis. Where there were once democracies, there are now police states. The Gestapo monitors every word, every thought. On the right side of the map, the Soviet Union. Vast, wounded, but undefeated. Territory from the Baltic to the Sea of Okhotsk, from the Arctic Ocean to the Black Sea. Eastern Europe and Asia are in its hands, but not the Far East. Japan reigns there. The Soviet economy is recovering. Slowly, painfully. Stalin mobilizes the entire country. Soviet workers are driven to restore factories to build new ones. Gulags are full of convicted individuals, former soldiers suspected of collaborating with the Germans, those dissatisfied with the party. Millions die from hunger, cold, and unbearable labor. But industry grows. The army is recovering. The USSR is preparing for the Cold War to turn hot at any moment. Now let's look at Asia. Japan reigns there with its gigantic empire. The Japanese army controls everything from India to Australia. But at the end of 45th year, Japan also received a slap in the face. American atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Wait, but if America did not enter the war in Europe, how can it be at war with Japan? Good question. In the alternative reality, this scenario is also possible. Some American isolationists believed that Japan was a threat to the Western Hemisphere. Maybe they would even agree to a war with Japan, but not with Germany. Or maybe the Japanese expansion continued longer than usual, threatening American interests in China and the Philippines, and this forced America to enter the war only with Japan. If so, American troops begin operations in the Pacific in 44th year. And in August of 45th, after Soviet troops entered Manchuria and captured Port Arthur, America drops the nuclear bombs. Isn't that a strange story? If Japan is simultaneously fighting the Soviet Union and America, well, yes, there is room for strangeness in history. But in our main scenario, where America is completely isolated, Japan exits the war sensibly, negotiating only with Britain and local factions in Asia, and retains its empire. No nuclear bombs. In this case, Japan becomes the third nuclear power around the same time as Germany and the USSR, at the end of 46th year. Now the planet has 3 nuclear superpowers, each controlling vast territories, each ready to use weapons in the event of war. The geopolitical configuration looks like this. Europe is divided in two between Germany and the USSR. Asia is divided between the USSR and Japan, with Japan controlling the richer and more developed parts. America remains on the periphery, owning the Western Hemisphere, and desired by no one. Now the question of the UN. In our real history, the United Nations organization was created in 45th year as an instrument for maintaining peace among the victors. The permanent members of the Security Council were the US, Britain, France, the USSR, and China. In the alternative world, the UN may not arise at all, or arise in a completely different form. Imagine a conference in some neutral city, maybe Geneva, maybe Stockholm. German, Soviet, and Japanese diplomats sit at the same table, and they create an international council, where each of the three superpowers gets veto power. Add to that weak European states that can vote but cannot decide anything. Or the UN is created, but without American influence. And without that ideal American vision of a universal order that we saw in our history. Instead, it is simply a forum for negotiations between hostile powers, cold and useless. The ideological confrontation develops completely differently. In our history, America was the champion of democracy and capitalism, and its opponent was Soviet communism. This struggle of ideologies permeated the entire Cold War. It defined movies, music, literature, even sports. But in the alternative world, there is no such clear dichotomy. Nazism is not a liberal ideology, but an authoritarian one. Communism is also authoritarian. They offer two variants of iron order, and it is difficult for ordinary people to choose which one is more free. Instead of a clear confrontation between democracy and dictatorship, we have a confrontation between two kinds of dictatorship. Maybe a third option is added, Nazism versus National Socialism, but that is too complicated for the ordinary person. Developing countries find themselves in the grip of three superpowers. If you are in Africa, the Germans try to expand influence through North Africa. If you are in Asia, Japan exports its authoritarian order. If you are on the sidelines, Soviet influence presses from the other side. You don't get to choose. You simply become an object of rivalry. The arms race between Germany, the Soviet Union, and Japan turns into a monstrous competition. Each state allocates huge funds for the development of newer and newer types of weapons, missiles, submarines, bombers. By the beginning of the 1950s, each of the three states possesses dozens of nuclear bombs. And America? America watches all this from its island of prosperity and begins to understand that it made a mistake. But it is too late to correct it. The country is politically split. A civil struggle is ongoing between supporters of entering the war against Germany and defenders of isolationism. Some politician will propose an alliance with the Soviet Union against Germany. Another will propose an alliance with Germany against the Soviets. And a third will scream that America must, without alliances, build its own nuclear arsenals and be ready for war with anyone. And so, by the end of 46 to the beginning of the 1950s, the world enters an era that can be called an even colder war than in our history. Because here there is no hope that some democracy will arrive from the West and save the world. Here are three totalitarian monsters, armed with nuclear weapons, ready at any moment to ignite a fire that will consume the planet. Humanity lives under the constant threat of nuclear war. But it is strange that under such a threat, people continue to live, work, love, and have children. Because there is no other choice. If you constantly fear war, then life loses all meaning. And so the world continues to spin, on the edge of an abyss, but still spinning. And America, rich but divided, looks at this world from afar and realizes that it can no longer stay out. But it is too late to intervene. History has turned in a direction that it cannot change. We talked about politics, war, and empires. And now let's talk about money and technology. Because they are what truly determine how ordinary people live in this alternative world. Let's start with money. In our real history, the Bretton Woods system emerged after the war. In the summer of 1944th year, when the Allies were already advancing on all fronts, representatives of 44 countries gathered in the American town of Bretton Woods. There, they agreed on a new global financial order. The essence was simple. The dollar becomes the main world currency, pegged to gold. Everyone could exchange $35 for an ounce of gold, and all other currencies were pegged to the dollar. America became the center of the world financial system. The dollar turned into what gold once was, a universal measure of value. But in the alternative world, America did not win the war, did not save Europe. It didn't even truly participate. Why should anyone accept the dollar as the world currency? There is no basis. And this is where the interesting part begins. If the war ended in an armistice between Germany and the USSR, the financial system looks completely different. Germany creates its own zone of currency influence. The Reichsmark becomes the mandatory currency for all occupied Europe. Paris trades with Rome in Reichsmarks. Warsaw buys goods in Berlin for Reichsmarks. All of Europe, from the Atlantic to the new border in the east, operates in the German currency. The Soviet Union naturally creates its system. The ruble becomes the currency for Eastern Europe in the Soviet sphere of influence. But this is a closed system. The ruble is not convertible. Trade occurs through state agreements. No free market. Japan does the same in Asia. The yen spreads throughout the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Chinese, Koreans, Filipinos are forced to use the Japanese currency for all transactions. And what about international trade between these three blocs? This is where the real headache begins. How can a Soviet factory buy German equipment if the ruble and Reichsmark are not convertible? They use gold, like in the Middle Ages, or barter. Oil is exchanged for machine tools, wheat for chemicals. World trade rolls back decades. London tries to maintain its role as a financial center, but this is no longer the same Britain. The pound sterling has lost its significance. British banks work, but they are secondary compared to Berlin or, strangely enough, Moscow. Without the Marshall Plan, Europe recovers painfully slowly. Let's recall what that program was. In 1947th year, American Secretary of State George Marshall announced that the U.S. would allocate huge sums for the reconstruction of Europe. Over 4 years, America transferred about $13 billion to European countries, a colossal amount at the time. This money went towards rebuilding factories, roads, bridges, and ports. Western Europe rose from the ruins in a few years and was already flourishing by the 1950s. But more importantly, the Marshall Plan tied European economies to the American one. They bought American goods, followed American recommendations, and adopted the American model of capitalism. In the alternative world, nothing of the sort exists. Germany reconstructs its zone independently, but does so rigidly. Resources from occupied countries are pumped into the metropole. French factories work for the German military industry. Polish coal goes to Germany. No one asks the local population what they want. Recovery is slow because Germany itself is exhausted by the war. By the beginning of the 1950s, Europe is still in ruins. Cities are rebuilt haphazardly, people live poorly, the standard of living is much lower than it was before the war. Now let's talk about technology. In our history, post-war America became the engine of technological progress. Computers, space, medicine, physics, Americans were ahead or on par with the Soviets everywhere. The first computers appeared during the war. The British created a machine to break German codes. The Americans developed a computer for calculating artillery tables. After the war, these developments turned into commercial computers, and the computer revolution began. But in the alternative world, everything is slower. Without urgent military necessity, computers remain exotic. Maybe the Germans create their computing machine for military needs. Maybe the Soviets do something similar. But there are no commercial computers. Until the 1950s, and perhaps even the 1960s, a computer is a gigantic room-sized machine, accessible only to the military and major scientific centers. Personal computers, as we know them, may not appear at all, or they appear 20 to 30 years later. And there is no need to talk about the internet. It was born from American military developments of the 1960s. The space race also looks different. In our history, it was a confrontation between the USSR and the USA. The Soviets launched the first satellite and the first human into space. The Americans responded by landing on the moon. Both sides invested monstrous resources in space programs for prestige. In the alternative world, the space race is a competition of three powers. Germany, the USSR, and Japan try to prove the superiority of their systems by launching rockets. But without American competition, the pace is slower. Maybe the first satellite is launched in the late 1950s, not in 1957. Maybe a human reaches space in the middle of the 1960s, not in 1961. And the moon landing may not happen at all. Too expensive. Why bother? Medicine also suffers. In our history, American research gave the world antibiotics, vaccines, and new treatments. The National Institutes of Health in the U.S. funded thousands of projects. American pharmaceutical companies developed new drugs. Without the American contribution, medical progress is slower. German medicine develops, but it is stained by war crimes, experiments on people in camps. Soviet medicine also works, but in isolation without exchange with Western science. Japanese medicine causes revulsion in the rest of the world after the atrocities in China. The result, many diseases that were defeated in our history in the 1950s and 1960s continue to kill people in the alternative world. Infant mortality is higher, life expectancy is lower. Culturally, the world is also poorer. In our history, American cinema, music, and literature spread across the planet. Hollywood became the world's dream factory. Rock and roll, jazz, blues, all American inventions that became global. In the alternative world, cultural life is divided into three closed zones. In German Europe, Nazi aesthetics thrive. Monumental, cold, propagandistic. In the Soviet zone, socialist realism, severe and ideologically verified. In the Japanese sphere, militarist propaganda with a nationalist bias. There is no free cultural exchange. Books are not translated, films are not shown, musicians do not tour. The world is divided by iron curtains, and each empire boils in its own juices. By the end of the 1940s and the beginning of the 1950s, humanity lives in a world that is poorer, more dangerous, and less free than it could have been. Technological progress is slowed, the economy is fragmented, culture is isolated, and over all this hangs the threat of a new war, this time with nuclear weapons. Not the brightest future, is it? And now we have reached the finale of our alternative journey. 80 years have passed since the end of that war where America stayed out. Let's see what the world has turned into by our day. Imagine the map of the planet in the year 2025. It looks completely different from the one we know. Europe is still divided. On one side, the German Federation, the successor to the Third Reich. Yes, maybe it became softer over the years, abandoned the most gruesome aspects of Nazism, carried out some reforms. But the essence remained. It is an authoritarian state with a rigid vertical power structure. The streets of Berlin, Paris, and Rome look prosperous. Tall buildings, clean roads, an efficient economy. But look closer. Cameras are everywhere, police on every corner. People speak in hushed tones about politics. There is no democracy here and never has been. The government is chosen through a complex system of corporate structures and party organs. Ordinary citizens have almost no influence on power. Culture in German Europe is monolithic and controlled. Cinema, music, literature, everything passes through censorship. Not direct, crude censorship as before, but soft, imperceptible censorship. It's simply that undesirable authors do not receive funding. Their books are not published by major houses. Their films are not shown in big theaters. To the east, the Eurasian Union, the successor to the USSR. It has also changed over 80 years, but remains authoritarian. Moscow still controls vast expanses from the Baltic to the Pacific Ocean. The economy works, but less efficiently than the Germans. The standard of living is lower, but the military machine is just as powerful. Atomic missiles, space stations, cyber troops. Between these two blocks, tension that has not subsided for decades. minor conflicts, economic wars, informational confrontation. Nuclear weapons hold them back from full-scale war, but living on the border of these empires is still terrifying. In Asia, the Japanese co-prosperity sphere reigns. Over 80 years, the Japanese have learned to be more subtle colonizers. They no longer stage mass atrocities, as in the 1940s. Instead, economic dominance, cultural expansion, technological control. Tokyo is the financial capital of Asia. Japanese corporations control economies from Indonesia to Australia. Japanese pop culture, anime, manga, music, has spread throughout the region. But behind the beautiful wrapper lies a rigid hierarchy. Japanese people are the supreme caste, other Asians are second-rate citizens. Formally there is equality, but in reality, discrimination at every turn. America in this world is a regional power. It is rich, but its wealth cannot compare to what it was in our reality. Latin America is completely subordinate to the U.S., economically, politically, culturally. Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, these are effectively American protectorates. South America resists, but is weak. American culture has not become global. Hollywood, as we know it, does not exist. There is, of course, American cinema, but it competes with German, Japanese, and Soviet film industries and does not dominate. Music is also regionalized. Rock and roll was born, but did not conquer the world. Jazz remained a local phenomenon. Technologically, the world in the year 2025 lags behind ours by 20 to 30 years. Computers exist, but they are bulky and expensive. The internet exists in a rudimentary form, closed corporate and military networks in each empire, but without global unification. Information does not flow freely. Each block controls its segment of the network. Space is less developed. Satellites fly, space stations operate, but the moon landing took place only in the early 2000s. Mars remains a dream. Without the American-Soviet space race that spurred progress, development proceeds slower. Medicine also lags. Many diseases defeated in our world in the 1970s and 1980s still kill people here. Average life expectancy is 5 to 10 years shorter. Pandemics occur more often because international cooperation is weak. Each empire develops vaccines for itself and is in no hurry to share. Human rights, that concept is almost unknown. In our world, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the UN in 1948th year, became a cornerstone of international law. But in the alternative world, such a declaration either does not exist or is an empty sound. Democracy exists only in a few small countries, maybe Switzerland, maybe Scandinavia, which manage to maintain neutrality. The rest of the world lives under authoritarian regimes of varying degrees of rigidity. Freedom of speech is a luxury available to few. Political prisoners exist in all three empires. Ecology is in a terrible state. Without the environmental movement that began in our world in the 1960s and 1970s, industry developed without regard for nature. Rivers are poisoned, the air in cities is dirty, forests are cut down. Climate change is accelerating because no one cared about limiting emissions. Ordinary people in this world live in an atmosphere of fear and control. Everywhere you look, authoritarian regimes, ideological indoctrination, restriction of freedoms. Yes, there is relative prosperity in the developed parts of the empires, but it is bought at the cost of freedom. The young generation of the year 2025 does not know that another world is possible. For them, it is normal to live under surveillance, not to express their opinion publicly, to accept that power is unreachable and immutable. They do not know Hollywood, rock music, the American dream. Their world is the world of the three empires, between which an endless, cold confrontation takes place. And somewhere in this world sits an old historian, flipping through dusty books and thinking, what if everything had gone differently? What if America had not stayed out? What would the world be like then? But these are just fantasies. Reality is what it is, and it is impossible to change it anymore. This is what the world looks like without American participation in the Second World War. Grim, divided, unfree. A world where technology lags, culture is poorer, and people are less free. Alternative history shows us how important those decisions made 80 years ago were, and how a single point of divergence can change the fate of all humanity.